join us and who are interested. So that's the session now being recorded. So once again, you are all very welcome, and we're delighted to have Kieran from the Irish Wildlife Trust joining us today to give us a talk about bees. And I suppose we have a thing within the volunteer centre that we try to start events on time. So we will, within the next minute, get started. So I suppose just to chat a little bit to yourselves about the volunteer centre. We're based in Letterkenny, but we offer a county-wide service, and we're interested in working with groups from across Donegal or any groups that impact on Donegal and supporting people to just maybe get more active in their community and volunteer as they go. So I'm just going to mute people as they come on, just so that it gets very distracting on Zoom if everybody's making noise at the one time. So just if you are looking to come in, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or something like that, or pop the questions into the chat. That's fine as well. But otherwise, we'll just ask that everybody stays muted for the duration of the session. Look, it's 2 o'clock now, so we're going to get started. Myself and Eamon from the Volunteer Centre will let people in as they arrive, but we don't punish those who turn up on time. So, Kieran, without further ado, we'll hand over to yourself to just do a quick introduction and tell us about your project and impress us with bees.
Grand. Yeah, thanks, John. So I like the on-time policy. It's a good way to be. Don't want to punish the people who come on time, right? So can everyone hear me okay there in your living rooms? Excellent. So yeah, so my name is Kieran Flood. I work for an organization called the Irish Wildlife Trust. And we work on loads of different things, all to do with wildlife, obviously. And we're a charity that we're membership based, so you can go online, you can join us if you want to get the magazine, support our work. But we work as many places as we can all over the country. So when it comes to the bees, we run a project called People for Bees, which is about getting people involved in helping save our bees and learning more about them. And we go all over the country with that. So we've been up in Donegal before, and hopefully we'll be back up there in person running training days and stuff soon. So that's the Irish Wildlife Trust. I can share a presentation just so we can have something to look at other than me. And I get going. I'll chat for, the presentation will be about 40 minutes long. Let me see, let's just make sure we can all see this now. Slideshow. Can you see that first slide? Yeah, thanks, John. Great, yeah, I'll chat for about 40 minutes and then we'll leave time for questions and all that. So we'll be finished within the hour or maybe a bit under. That was the plan. Great, okay, so if anyone has any burning questions throughout, like feel free to ask, or you can type it into the chat or save it for the end, whichever you prefer. And thanks to the Donegal Volunteer Centre for inviting me up virtually to do this talk today. Great, so I'll get going. So just sit back and relax. It's just going to be pictures of bees and a bit of a chat. Okay, so you may or may not have heard of something called the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. That's a great piece of work. It's a plan that was developed by specialists in bees to try and save our bees because they are in decline. So the Irish Wildlife Trust is a partner organisation of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. A lot of the images and things you'll see in this slideshow I would have borrowed from them. So they are really the first place to go for information on how to save the bees. We have information on our website too, but really theirs is kind of the hub of it all. That's the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. If you're not aware of it, I'll mention it again, but definitely check it out. Great. So one of the aspects of the pollinator plan is making Ireland more pollinator friendly. So that just means making Ireland a better place for our bees and other pollinating insects to live. And that's what we're going to look at today. So I'll go through a little bit about why bees are important and that, how they're declining, which is a bit sad. But we won't stay on that for too long because then we'll look at just actually the bees themselves, learn a little bit about the different types, because once you know a bit about how a creature works, how it does its day to day, how it survives, then you can kind of figure out pretty easily how to help it. So then the second half of the show will be just about how to help the bees. So that's just tips and tricks, things you can do in your garden, things you can do as community groups. So a lot of community groups have started working in this area. So I don't know if anyone on the call is doing that in a community group, but you can chat about it at the end if you like. Okay, so that's the plan. So what's this about making Ireland pollinator friendly? All animals, including people, need two things. Well, they need a few things, but two main things, and that's food and shelter, particularly on a day like today. I don't know what it's like up in Donegal, but it's not great down here. And food and shelter is what animals need. And we call that habitat. So that's just a simple term you've heard before, I'm sure, habitat. It's where an animal gets all its food and shelter, and plants as well. Plants need food, they need nutrients in the soil. So just at the start, just to say, that's basically what we're going to be talking about when we're talking about helping bees. We're talking about creating habitat, or alternatively, not destroying habitat that already exists. So it's all about helping them through habitat. And the food and shelter in the world of bees is pretty straightforward. Food is flowers, bee-friendly flowers, which I'll explain in a bit. And shelter is nest sites, somewhere for them to make their nests. So it's pretty straightforward. And flowers are the only place that bees get their food. They just eat pollen and nectar, which are two things you find within flowers. So it's actually straightforward enough in that sense. But why is there a pollinator plan, and why is the Irish Wildlife Trust campaigning about this? I suppose the first thing is that pollinators are really important. If we were to be purely selfish humans about it, pollinators help us by pollinating our crops. So lots of our food exists because insects like bees and wasps and hoverflies and other pollinators have pollinated the flower. So you can see here, there's a bee, she's on a bramble bush there. And that bramble bush gets its flowers in the spring, and it'll only create its berries in the autumn if it's pollinated. And that's the case for most fruits, that they start off as a flower that must be pollinated by an insect or sometimes by the wind. So they're pollinating our crops for us. The other thing is they don't just pollinate the crops that humans eat, they pollinate lots of other plants as well. So they keep our ecosystem going. They help the plants to produce their fruit, within which is their seed. So they help the plants reproduce. So if there was no pollinators, there'd be less crops, but there'd also be just less plants in general on the planet. So they're very important. The other reason why we are concerned and trying to take action and asking others to take action is because, unfortunately, they are declining. So I won't go into too much detail on this, but just it is always good to at least recognize some of the not very nice facts, such as that bees are declining in Ireland. So this is just a few bits of info from a study from 2006, which was a big study carried out by bee specialists on the bees of Ireland, and they found that a third of our bees are threatened with extinction. So 6 are critically endangered, which means they're very close to extinction. 10 are endangered and 14 are vulnerable. And more than half of Ireland's bee species have undergone a substantial decline in their numbers. So essentially, they are reducing in numbers, a lot of the species, and in where they're found. So that's called their distribution. And more recently, the Biodiversity Data Centre, the National Biodiversity Data Centre, they study bumblebees. They literally get volunteers to count them all across the country, including Donegal. And they found that bumblebees are still declining at the moment. And even common bumblebees, like this one here, the common carder, are actually declining as well. So there's definitely, a problem there. You might ask why. I'll just show you these maps first. This is just an example of one species called the great yellow bumblebee. It's a a big yellow fluffy bumblebee, as you can see on the photo. And this map on the purple squares shows you where it's been found before. But all the purple squares in the map right now are where it's been found since we started taking records, so for way back. Now, this map is just where it's been found in the last 10 years. And you can see its distribution is really shrank. So the first map, it was right up the top of Donegal, along the west coast and down the south, as well as being, in the east coast of Ireland, the south and the west. But then it's gone. So its distribution has shrunk to just parts of Connemara, and it's got a stronghold in Belmullet as well. And then if you look at just last year's records, it's shrunk even again. Now, maybe people just didn't happen to find it last year in the other places, but really it does show you that it's not doing that well. So when a species like that is just hanging in one part of Ireland, if something happens in that area, like a disease comes in or there's bad weather, it could actually wipe the species out completely, make it go extinct. So that's just one example. Now that is one of the more endangered species that we have, but that just shows you how it can happen, how they can disappear beneath our very eyes. And you might ask why. And the reason that the specialists in bees think is the main reason is habitat loss. So that would be things like bees use old hay meadows, they use hedgerows, they use coastal meadows and coastal sand dune areas. And we've removed a lot of that from Ireland over the last few decades. We don't really use the old hay meadows anymore because we cut for silage now. We use like lots of fertilizers to get the grass growing good and strong, and then we get a few cuts of silage in. So that when we do that, the bees can't live there. Whereas in a meadow, they were able to live there. So they've lost that. We've also taken out a lot of hedgerows around the country. They've lost them because they're good places for them to live. And some of our coastal areas we've turned into golf courses or kind of or resorts and things. So we have taken away their habitat. We've made them homeless. So that's the main reason why they're declining. Other things like pesticides and climate change come into it as well. But the main thing is we've just taken away their home. So that's the sad part. But we won't stop there because I'll take a breath and then I'll start just telling you about the bees themselves, and then we'll talk about how to help them. Okay, so if you have any questions about the decline thing, we can chat about that at the end, or you can pop it into there's a chat function where you can write in things on this Zoom as well. Okay, so who are we here to help? If you think about bees, most people would think about the honeybee, but we've got lots of different types. So if we take it from the very start, bees are in a group of animals called Hymenoptera, which have ants and wasps in them as well. So they're all quite related. They've all got 4 wings. Now the ants don't always have their wings, but you may remember how they grow wings, or they have wings and they fly around. Sometimes you see the flying ants. So that's the queens and the males flying around to disperse. And the bees and the wasps, they always have them. So they've got 4 wings and they can all sting. So they're all related. They've all got 4 wings and they can all sting you, the bees, ants, and wasps. If we're just going to look at the bees a bit closer, there's 3 different types of bee, 3 different ways of being a bee. There's honeybees, bumblebees, and solitary bees. And in Ireland, we've got 1 species of honeybee. We've got 20 different species of bumblebee and 77 species of solitary bees. So loads of the little solitary bees, loads of different types of them. And we've got 1 extra bee that's arrived recently, an extra type of bumblebee. So we got 98 bees altogether, 98 different species of bee in Ireland. So a lot more than most people would realize, a lot more different species. And I'll just run through them quickly, the 3 different types, not all 98 species. So honeybees, we all know them. They're sort of slender-bodied bees with the striped black and yellow body, and they live mostly in beehives that we put out for them, and they produce lots of honey. They make that to feed their young and to feed themselves. Honeybees are social, so they live in a big group with thousands and thousands of bees in the hive, and they form a colony. So they live together in a social group. They all work together and they're all related, and there's a queen that's in charge. And they produce lots of honey from the nectar. So they literally go out and get mouthfuls of nectar, bring it back, put it all together inside the hive and turn it into honey. The honeybees, they are pretty good at surviving because they work together and they have a hive to live in, and they can survive the winter eating the honey that they build up during the summer and the autumn. They actually cluster together inside the hive in a big sort of hug, really, to stay warm during the winter, and that's called a winter cluster. And that way they can survive the winter, and the queen can live for a couple of years. Not that many, but you know, more than one. So they're kind of a perennial if they were like a flower. There's one species that's, as I mentioned, we have in Ireland. It's native to Ireland, and that the species name is Apis mellifera mellifera. It's called the dark bee. So that's the honeybees. I shall move on because we're all pretty familiar with them. Solitary bees are the other type in Ireland, and we've got 77 different species of those, and they come in all sorts of colors and shapes. They're normally quite small, so you mightn't have noticed them much. Sometimes they can just look a bit like a fly or a wasp, but they are certainly bees. They, if you look closely, they tend to have hairy bodies and four wings, and they are little bees. And they do pollination too. They visit their flowers. That's the only place they get food. And when they visit the flowers, they do all that pollination that helps produce our fruits. So there's great diversity. I'll show you a few pictures of them there, a few close-ups. This is one called the ashy mining bee. And she is gray and jet black. It's quite striking. And you can see that's her there on a flower. There's the nomad bee, which is a little another little solitary bee. It looks a bit like a wasp at first glance, but when you look closer, it's more delicate and doesn't have the big sting that a wasp would have. Nomad bees are actually sneaky. They will sneak into the nests of other solitary bees and lay their eggs in there. So they're kind of like cuckoos, like the cuckoo bird, but a bee version. That's the nomad bee. And then the violin carpenter bee, this is not very common in Ireland, but I just thought I'd show you a picture because it shows you how the solitary bees look quite different to the different species. This is a big one that looks kind of a bit like a giant blue bottle. That's just a few pictures. We won't go through all the different species, but if you're trying to think about how to help bees, it's good to know a bit about how they work. So with the solitary bees, we have some of them are what we call mining bees. And that means for their shelter, they dig into the ground. They dig these little tunnels that you can see on screen. They're only a couple of mils across at the entrance, and that's where they lay their eggs. So solitary bees, they don't live in a big group, and they have no queen in charge. That's why they're called solitary. They find somewhere to lay their eggs after they mated, and they lay their eggs, and they don't work together or live in a big group. So some of them dig these little tunnels, and we call them mining bees. But other ones go into cavities. So they might go into old rotten bits of wood or twigs, or into old kind of stone walls and things like that. So they'll go into little cavities. And they're called cavity nesting bees. So we have the miners and the cavity nesting bees. And that's our solitary bees. So there's two different types. And the way they work is the life cycle, which is how they survive, is similar in all the different solitary bees. So what they do is they find a nesting place, and they go out and they gather pollen from the flowers, and they mix it with nectar, and they actually make something called bee bread, a little ball of pollen and nectar mixed together. They put that in their nest. So whether it's a little tunnel they've dug or inside a cavity, and then they lay their egg right onto that bee bread, and then they seal up the tunnel. The egg hatches, and like most insects, it starts off as an egg and then it hatches out as a larva. So it's a sort of a caterpillar type squishy stage, sometimes called a grub. So the larva doesn't have to go anywhere because it's actually woken up right out on its breakfast. It's on the bee bread. So it just eats that and gets the energy to go to the next stage of its life cycle, which is the pupa. So like a way a butterfly goes into a cocoon. So again, without having to leave the cavity, it goes into its pupa, and that will last through the winter. And then in the spring, it emerges as a new adult. So that's how solitary bees survive. There's some photos of it here. This is a leaf cutting solitary bee. And she has put her egg in this tunnel, in this cavity of it looks like she's on a bee hotel. And she's cut these leaves perfectly with her teeth. It looks like someone uses scissors, but she did that. And she sealed up the tunnel with the leaves. Sometimes they use mud as well, sticky clay mud. So she sealed it up, and she's laid her egg on the bee bread. That egg will hatch, will eat the bee bread, will go into a pupa over the winter. And then next year, when it hatches, it'll bite a little hole in the front, and then it's ready to go. And what they do is before they start flying, they need to warm up. So they need to take in the sun for a while. They need to do some sunbathing to warm themselves up before they can start their life on the wing. So that's how solitary bees work. So all the different species and colors of solitary bee, that's roughly how they all work. They need to find a nest site, and they don't work together. They just mate and find their own nest site, lay their eggs. Once the eggs are laid, the parents they don't do any help really, they just leave them be, and then they hatch. So it happens like this. In the springtime, the new ones come out, the new adults. They'll mate and they'll look for nesting sites. So during the late spring, early summer, you'll see them doing that. They'll lay their eggs in the nests. And then towards the end of the year, like in the autumn, all the adults will die. And it's just the eggs in the tunnels and the cavities that survive through the winter and come out again in the spring. So it's really important that in the spring there's flowers for these newly emerged baby solitary bees to feed on. So learning a bit about the way they work helps you figure out how you can help them. So it's very clear that the spring is an important time for them to get food. And then the other thing they need is a bit later on in the year, they need nesting sites. And I'll go into more details about how we can help them there. So that's the solitary bees. I'm going to move on to the bumblebees. And then maybe we might have some questions, we'll see. So bumblebees are the third type of bee in Ireland. Oops. Bumblebees are great because they are easier to spot. They're big and fluffy, and they make a lot of noise. They make a lovely loud buzzing noise. And there's 21 different species now of bumblebee in Ireland. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. So bumblebees are a bit of a mix between the two. So bumblebees are social. They do have a queen, but they don't live in huge numbers like the honeybee. The honeybee would have up to 20,000 bees in their hive. The bumblebees would only have about 50 to 200. But they have a queen. So there's the queens, the workers, and the males. The workers are all female. So the queens and workers are both female. One way to tell the males and the females apart is usually the males have a little bit of extra color. So male bumblebees normally have some yellow on their face or near their front of their body, a little bit of extra color on them. Another way to tell the males and the females apart is that the females have pollen baskets. So if you see in this photograph here, this bee, she has a big lump of pollen hanging off her back leg. And that's because she's got a special part of her leg that's flat and smooth for her to stick the pollen on. So that just if you see, pardon me, if you see them, a female bee, you'll notice her back leg, it's not hairy at the top. It's smooth and flat for her to stick the pollen on. So when she's out foraging, she can gather lots of pollen and then bring it back to the nest in one go. So you've got queens and workers and males within the bumblebee nest. Okay, just checking the questions there. Okay, so that's the bumblebees, and what they do is they make a nest. So this is a bumblebee nest you can see here. It's about the size of a small football, and they make it themselves. And they make the nest usually either just on the ground or below the ground in a mouse hole. And the queen makes the nest. She starts the nest herself, and then her workers help her finish it off. And they need a nest to survive. So like the solitary bees, they need to find their own nesting site. We don't provide hives or anything for them. So the life cycle of the bumblebee is very interesting. She starts off in the spring. She wakes up from hibernation. So bumblebees actually hibernate. So the queens hibernate over the winter. So the queens wake up in the springtime, and the first thing they do is start looking for food to feed themselves. So just like the solitary bees in the springtime, the bumblebees are coming out of hibernation, and they haven't eaten in weeks, and they're starving, so they need food. So that's why it's really important to plant or just leave flowers in your garden that flower early. So dandelions are really good for that reason, because they come out early. Sometimes the willow trees come out nice and early with their flower, and the heathers. So early flowering plants are really important for queen bumblebees when they come out of hibernation. So she comes out of hibernation and she gets some food as soon as she can. You see in the springtime, you see or you see queen bumblebees sometimes lying on the ground because they're exhausted because they haven't managed to find any food. So we really need to help them by that early flowering plants. Once she's found some food, she'll start looking for a nest site. So that's somewhere that's undisturbed by people that she can go in and starting her nest. When she does that, she'll make bee bread, a pollen loaf, and she'll lay her eggs on that. And then she'll sit on that like a bird, actually. She'll sit on the eggs. They hatch and they're all workers, and they help her build the nest. Nest gets bigger. The workers start going out, bringing back food. So she lays more eggs. And by the summertime, there's a bumblebee nest with, like, as I said, 50 or maybe even 200 bees in it. Then towards the end of the summer, she will start laying eggs that become males. They're the ones that look a little bit different. And then she will also allow some of the females to develop into queens. So you get new queens and males in the autumn. They leave the nest and they disperse and they find other new queens and males and they mate. And what happens then after that, after the mating in the late autumn, when it starts to get cold, is that everything except the new queens, so the old queen, all her workers and all the males die. So the bumblebee nest is like, it's just less than a year it survives. So it's like an annual flower. It doesn't even survive a full year. What's left is the new queens who have mated. They go into hibernation, so they crawl in underneath a log or something, or into an old hole in the bank. They come out of hibernation in the springtime after spending the winter in there, and they start the whole cycle all over again. So those queens coming out in the springtime are very important because they've mated, so they have the eggs inside them to start the cycle all over again. And the way it works is that the eggs she lays at the start are all female, because in the bee world, eggs that have been fertilized are female, but she can lay eggs that haven't been fertilized, that weren't fertilized when she mated, and they become males. So it's very odd, completely different to us, but fertilized eggs in the bee world become females, and unfertilized eggs, they are viable and they grow and survive, but they're males. Another difference in the bee world is that between males and females is that males cannot sting. It's only the females that will sting you. Males don't even have a sting. So the bumblebees are great. They've got loads of different colors and different species, and they're quite easy to start learning your bumblebees and trying to tell them apart. So I might take a quick pause there to see if there's any questions about the different types of bees and the bumblebee and the solitary and the honeybee. If not, then I'll go on to the next bit of the presentation, which is about how to help our bees. So I'll just...
That's really interesting. There is a question in on the chat from Ailish about the best way to record the different bee species for the biodiversity data center. You know, how do people get involved in that? And a previous one, which is about encouraging bees in your garden, but I think that'll be your second half of your talk, so we'll hold this.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I see those two there now. So yeah, the first thing you're supposed to do is, if you want to start recording your bees, as I just mentioned just there at the very end, bumblebees are the way to start. They are easy enough to tell some of them apart anyway. So you can get a little swatch which tells you how to identify the different bees. You can actually buy them from the data center and they'll post it out to you. I think it's about six or €8. Plus, there's lots of things you can find online, guides and things. I can send some to John to send around to you afterwards. And then it's just the case of starting to learn the different types of bumblebees. That's where I'd start. You can then start recording your sightings on the National Biodiversity Data Center website. It's very straightforward. Anything you find, if you just go out in the garden and you spot one bee and you think, okay, I know that one, you can just jot it down and go online and just let them know you found it. And all you need to tell them is what date it is, where you're located, and what bee you saw. And that's how you start. If you get better at learning your bees, and if you want to do more, you can start doing a special survey where you go out once a month and you walk a kilometer of your area, and you just walk the same kilometer each time, once a month from March to September, and you record what bumblebees you see. And again, then there's a special form to tell them what you saw. But the best way to start is to just learn a few bumblebees and start recording what you see in your garden, what you see in your park. And it's a nice thing to do as a community as well. You could do it with, you could try and record what things you're seeing in community gardens or places in the community as well. Okay. So I hope that's good. And I'll send on a few links to places where you can start learning your bees. It's not part of today's talk really, but it's another talk we do, and it's definitely important.
Very good. No, that'd be great. And we'll share out those links with everybody who registered for the talk. Can I ask a question about the newbie who showed up?
Yeah.
Where did they come from? And should we be worried?
Yeah, it's topical because there was talk of the hornet last week. I think there was one found. We shouldn't be worried. The newbie that I mentioned is a species of bumblebee called the tree bumblebee, and they were found in Dublin. So bees can sometimes actually cross bodies of water. So that it's thought that they can disperse from Wales, like the closest point to Ireland, or yeah, so they can come across. And it has happened before that as well with another species of bumblebee. And luckily, fingers crossed, that none of them have had any bad consequences for our other bees. So they've just sort of naturally colonized and not upset the balance of things. Now, the hornet that was in the news, obviously, that's different. That's from, the other side of the world, and it's been brought over by man accidentally, and that can do damage to bees and other insects if it gets in. So let's hope it doesn't come over. But yeah, the tree bumblebee, it actually nests in the trees, which is different to all the other bumblebees. So there won't be too much competition for it there. It won't be kicking out any other bees to make its nest. They sometimes even nest in bird boxes in the UK. It's been spotted that they do that. Yeah, so that's the tree bumblebee. That's the new one.
Very good. Well, that's good that we don't have to worry. Because I'm thinking back to movies and stuff like that, but no, that's fantastic. And it's great to see how, I suppose, they spread, and you wouldn't have thought they would have made it from, I presume, Holyhead to Dublin. It's quite the journey on little.
Yeah, it is. I don't know much about that aspect, like how they do the longer journeys, because normally it's just a short journey, but I guess it's maybe if there's an air current and they're dispersing anyway. Yeah, that must be how they get here.
No.
So yeah, it's very interesting.
Very good. Thank you. We'll let you carry on.
Great. Yeah, so we've got a bit more. I'll talk a bit now about some tips and tricks for helping them. The reason I talk first about the different types of bees is once you know a bit more about the bees, the rest is actually easy enough. There's lots of guides you can look up now for the right plants and things, but I'll go through it all the same. There we go. Okay, so to help the bees in your garden or your community, we're giving them places to make their nests and food. Let's talk about food first. So I mentioned already dandelions. They're really good because they come out early in the year and their nectar starts flowing. They produce the nectar in cold temperatures. So early in the year in Ireland is usually cold. So it's just a great way to help the bees. It's really good to basically just not cut the grass early in the year. And I know it's really tempting to get that first cut in when it starts to get sunny. It's a nice feeling. But if you can just wait a couple of weeks, for example, during March, wait a couple of weeks until other flowers start to bloom, and then you can cut your grass. All those dandelions that are in your lawn will really help the bees. So it's hard to do if you're used to always cutting early. And if you don't like dandelions, it's hard to do, but really dandelions are quite lovely yellow flowers. And yeah, it's good for the bees to let the dandelions grow at least for a few weeks at the start of in spring. The other thing then is if you just don't cut your grass as often. So if you only mow it every 6 weeks, which, you know, looks maybe it does look a bit longer and you might feel you're being a bit lazy. But if you just mow the grass a bit less, you'll still be able to get through it in the mower, like in 6 weeks. It won't be up to your waist or anything, but it will let lots of flowers bloom that are already in your area. Already their seeds are probably in the soil, but they just don't get a chance to bloom. So I'm talking about clover, dandelions, self-heal, vetches. So these are not very showy. They're not big, showy flowers, but they're all brilliant for the bees. So that's actually a really important thing. If you can let just like a patch of your lawn, maybe a side or a corner, or the whole thing if you like, just mow it less. So the recommendation is 6 to 8 weeks. It is enough time for the flowers to bloom, and that will help the bees and other insects as well. Meadows is another thing. Meadows is a little different. It's when you don't cut the grass for the whole year and you just cut it at the end. And that's how we used to make hay, and still do in some places. So when you think of meadows, sometimes people think of these alpine meadows like in the picture. But really a meadow in Ireland can look more like this. You can spot it is things like clover and dandelion in here. And they're really good for the bees. Now, the difference between just cutting your grass less often, like I said a minute ago, and the meadow is the meadow you only cut it once a year. What you're doing in a meadow is you're letting the wildflowers go through their full life cycle and producing food in terms of pollen and nectar and producing seeds. Then at the end of the year, when you cut it in the autumn, you have to take all the cuttings away, because a meadow is basically grass and wildflowers fighting against each other for light and nutrients. But the grass grows really strong when there's lots of nutrients. So it never put fertilizer on your meadow, and always take your cuttings away, because if you leave them, they'll rot down and they'll fertilize the soil and the grass will take over. And so will the other plants that respond a lot to nutrients like dockweeds and hogweed and stuff. So for your meadow, you need to, if you're going to try to make a meadow, try somewhere that isn't very fertilized. Cut it once a year and take the cuttings away. In the first year, you might need to cut it actually a few times just to sort of get some of the nutrients away from the meadow. And that's it. You don't need to plant seeds or anything. If you are planting seeds, if you're in a rush to see some results, definitely just try and plant Irish ones, not bought from overseas in the supermarket. But really, you don't need to. You just need to give it time and change the way you cut it. One thing to say is you will, you might need some equipment, because if you leave it for a full year and you only cut it in the autumn, it will be too long for the mower. So if you don't want to be having to go out, get the strimmer or get a parasite, this isn't the project for you. I would just go with cutting it once every 6 to 8 weeks. That's much easier. But if you want to try the meadow, that's how to do it. And there's a really good booklet explaining it all that I'll send to John to send around to everyone. And this is an interesting thing. This yellow flower on the screen is called yellow rattle. And it is a parasite, a hemiparasite of grass. So it actually taps into the grass and steals some of the grass's nutrients. So if you have that in your meadow, it helps keep the grass in check, which helps all the other wildflowers. And it's a native Irish species. So you can try and gather some yellow rattle if you see it locally and introduce it to a meadow if you like. So that's meadows. Meadows, dandelions, and how you manage your grass. So they're really big things. So this is another one. It's just that we're starting to kind of learn about this, and for years, no one thought about it. No one really knew about it. Certainly I didn't, but a lot of our favorite flowers that we plant, daffodils and petunias and begonias, have got almost no food in them for the bees. So you just need to be aware that you need to plant other things as well. Now you can still have your daffodils because they're so reliable for color, but you need other things too if you want to help the pollinators. And there's loads to choose from, and there's loads of info of where you can find them. So again, I'll send on the lists which you can get on the internet and download or print off. But another great thing is if you go to the garden centers nowadays, you see a lot of them have this little logo and they actually let you know which flowers are good for bees. The Royal Horticultural Society do it. So some garden centers will have the British plants that have the Royal RHS, but also Irish producers have started to do it too. Really handy to look out for that little symbol showing the bee on your flowers. And there's loads and loads of options. These slides are from a biodiversity data center pollinator plan slideshow, and you can see there's just so many different options of things you can plant that are bee friendly. So the best way to go about it is to get stuff in the spring that flowers in the spring, summer, and the autumn, because you need the early flowering plants in the spring for when the bees are coming out of hibernation and the solitaries are just hatching. And then you want to try and have something in the autumn so the bees can build up before hibernation. And there's huge amounts to choose from. A lot of our ornamentals, you can get ornamentals that work. But your wildflowers obviously are great as well. But then also there's lots of trees and shrubs like common stuff like Mahonia and Deutzia and Viburnum. They are really good. And a good shrub is great because it just comes back every year. Maybe you need to give it a bit of a prune, but it'll keep coming back. Cotoneaster, full of flowers for the bees. And then your fruit and veg. If you grow your own fruit and vegetables, a lot of those plants are pollinator friendly. And just to say what pollinator friendly, all that means is some of our flowers we have bred to be really big and colorful, or have loads of petals, but they don't have, sometimes they don't have any nectar or pollen in them, or they've got so many petals that the bee can't get in to get the nectar or pollen. So bee friendly just means that they're nice, they're an open flower, the bee can get in, and that the flower produces nectar and pollen for the bee to eat. That's all. And there's loads of options out there. It's just a case of figuring out which ones work in your garden. There's bee-friendly bulbs, so crocuses and alliums and snowdrops, they're all good for the bees. So there's a bit of everything really. There's fruit and veg, there's bulbs. So if you're thinking about your garden or your community, just right now in the summer, you could be looking at maybe planting some ornamentals that are bee-friendly. You could grow some fruits and vegetables. Fruit trees are better to plant in the autumn or early spring. So maybe don't do that right now, but you can be growing your other fruits and veg, and you can change the way you're mowing. So there's 3 tips that you can do right now in the summer that will help the bees. And I'll stop for questions in a second. I'll just quickly touch on helping them find somewhere to nest. So the mining bees, the solitary bees that nest in cavities, the ones that don't mine, you can put out bee hotels for them. And you might have seen bee hotels or put one up already. They're just giving a place for the solitary nesting, cavity nesting bees. So that's just some of our solitary bees. Most of them are actually mining bees, but you can help them with the bee hotels. Solitary bees don't normally travel very far, so it's very important where you put the bee hotel. It needs to be near bee-friendly habitat, so food. So you can't put the bee hotel in the middle of a giant car park with no plants in it. Nothing will use it then. Or way up high on the side of a building. It needs to be somewhere, a few little tips. It needs to be not on the ground, it needs to be off the ground, facing the sun, so south or southeast, and it needs to be near bee-friendly flowers. And then you might get some cavity nesting bees using your bee hotel, which would be great for them. For the mining bees, you can do a thing where you actually just hand weed a little bit of dry, free draining soil. So they don't use waterlogged soil, but like a bank, you can hand weed it and open up, expose some soil, and you might get the mining bees moving in and using that for their shelter. So that's the mining bees and the cavity nesting solitary bees you can help. And finally, for the bumblebees, for their nest, they just need to be left alone and they need some long vegetation. So bumblebees will look for, they might sometimes go into the edge of woodland, but they'll often go into long tussocky grass, and they'll actually make their nests in the tussocks. So overgrown, basically, grass that doesn't get cut very often at all. Maybe not even every year, like maybe just abandoned sort of thing. But that is actually what they need. They need vegetation that's let get thick and is left alone. They can survive in vegetation that is cut, but only if it's only cut in the autumn after the nest has stopped. So that's how you look after the bumblebees, is you just basically leave some areas be. Now, it mightn't look that pretty to the human eye, so maybe just leave a corner, or it's the way you manage your hedgerow. You could just make sure to leave the base of the hedgerow and not to spray it or cut it in the middle of the season, and not to spray it at all, and then it'll be good for the bumblebees. So you can help the bumblebees and the solitary bees by the way you manage your garden and your community, to give them places to make their nests as well. Grand. So I'll stop there after 45 minutes. And any questions, we can just go ahead. So I'd see, is there some in the chat?
There's a few in the chat. All right, Kieran, so I'll let you go into it there.
So we have Ailish's question, then the recording question. Okay, mostly just thanks, which is great. A lot of garden center plants are grown with chemicals, and even if they say pollinator friendly, they will harm the bees because of the way they're grown. I only found out about this last year. Some nurseries produce their own plants and are chemical free, but not that many. Yeah, Linda, that's a good point if you think about it. Like, now I wouldn't say, it depends. Yeah, some of the growers might use pesticides, and that's bad for insects. So it's a good point that if you're trying to be really thorough, you should watch out where you buy your flowers. Obviously, wildflowers you will just grow naturally in your garden. You don't need to buy them at all. But if you are buying plants, you could look into where they're coming from. Is there a list of flowers specific for bumblebees? Somebody else is asking. No, I wouldn't say necessarily, because the solitary bees and the honeybees and the bumblebees, they will use the same flowers. So you don't need to worry about getting ones that are just for bumblebees. Basically, most bee-friendly flowers will help your bumblebees if you want to help them in particular. So yeah, you don't need to find special bumblebee flowers. Just anything that says it's bee-friendly will help the bumblebees. Okay. Any more questions while we're here?
Yeah, if there's anybody else there, if you want to unmute and ask, or pop it in the chat, whatever suits yourself. Kieran, I can't get over the fact that there's so many different types of bee. I would, if you'd have asked me at the start, I would have said maybe 5 or 6.
Yeah,
It's phenomenal. And you see there where you do come across them, maybe in the springtime, and they're maybe on a windowsill or something like that, where they're struggling, and they're not. Yeah, they just need that little bit of energy. What would you recommend to give them?
So yeah, this is that's because, as you learned from the presentation, that's because at the start of the year, they can be very weak and there's not a lot of flowers. And sometimes they get so weak, they just lay there and do nothing. In that situation, if you like, you can give them sugar water.
Mhm.
So that will just give them the energy to get moving again. So you can go into the house and dissolve some sugar in water and put the spoon in front of them, and they will actually, you'll see their little tongue come out and they might drink that up. But what I do, rather than kind of making up sugar water for them and kind of interfering that much, I might sometimes just pick them up and put them on a dandelion or a flower that's nearby. And that would obviously, will help them out as well.
Mhm.
It's a bit of a more natural way of doing it. Yeah, but I guess the main thing is if we create the right habitat by, letting the wildflowers grow and changing the way we manage our grass and not using the sprays, you'll still lose the odd bee like that, but the majority of them will be fine, if we have the habitat for them.
Very good. There's one or two more things in there on the chat. Just any good
Yeah.
herbs or vegetables that are for bees?
Yeah, so herbs definitely. So I actually myself have tried this out in the garden. Rosemary is really good. They love rosemary. Pretty much all the herbs actually will flower at some stage in their cycle, and it's good for the bees. But they love rosemary, and lavender are really good. And I suppose, yeah, rather than just saying check the list, it's always nice to say a few things. So rosemary and lavender and thyme, they all work. If you have things like chives and onions and you let them go into flower, they're really good too. So that's the allium family.
Mhm.
And then something called catmint. It's a herby looking sort of small bushy flower, and it has purple flowers on it. And it's called catmint, and that's really good too. The bees absolutely love that. So there are things that don't take up much space. You can stick them in a pot on your windowsill or just at your front doorstep, and they're really good for the bees. Yeah. And then someone asked about moving bee hotels indoors over winter. I've never heard about that now, actually, Mary. Maybe some places they recommend it, but no, I haven't heard about moving them indoors. The bees in them should be used to the Irish weather and be able to survive the winter. So I don't know if that's the best thing to do. There is a good guidebook on using bee hotels from the pollinator plan, and yeah, it doesn't mention that now, but they must do it somewhere, maybe somewhere where they have very cold winters or something.
Maybe the weather is a wee bit rougher in Donegal.
Yeah.
No, I suppose, yeah, it is. And I suppose, yeah, if it's somewhere that's safe and is not going to be impacted by the wind, you'd figure it should be safe to go forward.
Yeah, if it's very windy, I suppose the bee hotel, they tend to be little wooden boxes, so it could get blown off all right if it was in a very exposed spot. That's a good point. And someone's asking when's the best time to plant heathers. I don't actually know. I think heathers are fairly hardy. I'm not sure if there's a particular time of year. I've bought them just from the garden centre while in flower and planted them at home, and they've survived, and then the bees have used them. So there are different types of heather now. Some of them are early flowering, some of them are late flowering. So some of them will flower in the autumn, but others don't flower until the winter, late winter. And both are good for bees because actually there's not that many flowers in autumn or late winter. Other good things for those times of year is there's a flower called a hellebore, a winter hellebore. And they're beautiful flowers that come out really early in the winter. And it's nice to have them in your garden because they're one of the first things that'll come out, winter hellebore, and the bees like them as well. So that's another good recommendation for that time of year when there's not a lot in flower. Yeah, so winter hellebore is a good one for the winter time.
Very good. No, that's fantastic. Yeah, look, unless there's any other questions. Sorry, Eamon, do you want to come in there? Yeah.
I have my hand up.
Well, you better.
The question into the chat. But
Hi, how are we doing? First of all, I want to say I'm very impressed with the presentation. Thanks very much. It was very informative and very entertaining. I also am very encouraged by the 30 odd people that showed up from all over the county and all over the country. It shows a great interest. My question is this, now that we are almost all vaccinated and all community centres will be opening up, hopefully, crossed fingers, come the autumn, are there any Irish Wildlife Trust projects that we could offer out or mention to men sheds, to groups, community centres that could be promoted from the reopening after COVID?
Good question. I suppose we don't have anything coming up on the ground in Donegal, which is the straight answer, which is unfortunate. We are quite a small organization in terms of staff. We don't have enough people to sort of cover, go out around the country in each county. So we don't have anything happening in Donegal at the moment, but I would say the best way to find out, I think when it comes to the bees, what you could do if you are a men's shed or a community group is, you know, you could get in touch with me and we could give you a talk over Zoom or come up when things open up, or you could check out the All Ireland Pollinator Plan and their guidebooks and their things and probably start trying out some like making bee hotels or doing bee planting yourself. But the Irish Wildlife Trust doesn't actually have any projects running in Donegal at the moment. So hopefully in the future we'll kind of be able to expand and have events all over the country. We have voluntary branches, and that's the way that we get active in different counties. And we don't have one in Donegal at the moment. We're starting to spread them around. So we have one in Galway and Kerry and Cork. But I think the opening up a branch in Donegal would be a great idea. So, and the branches are just groups, people get together and do run small projects and organize walks and talks and things. It's been quiet with COVID, like we haven't opened a new branch in a while, but we are just opening a new one in Limerick now. And we certainly could try and get one open in Donegal soon.
That'd be great.
So there you go.
No, that'd be great. There's one question that came in there, and it's from Pat McCarthy, who obviously has a garden like mine. It's full of daisies. Are they good for the bees?
The ox-eye daisies, the big ones, I think they're definitely good. The smaller, more common species, I'm not sure. I haven't seen too many bees on them in my time now, and I don't recollect seeing them on the list of the best species. So I'd say maybe they're more neutral. I don't know if they're particularly good for bees, but they're not any harm either, definitely, and they definitely would have probably benefit other insects and things. But I don't know if they're particularly good for bees.
Okay, well, so myself and Pat can continue to make daisy chains.
Yeah, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty about using them for daisy chains.
That's fantastic. Kieran, thank you very much. And people are just commenting there about that idea for the men sheds around the bee hotels or the bug hotels, and National Biodiversity Centre is NBDC. So you throw me there when you stick in these acronyms that I haven't prepared.
Yeah.
But and Tidy Towns, I know a lot of Tidy Towns are involved in environmental projects now, and are involved in projects that go beyond, the litter and the pretty flowers. So there's a lot of points for that. So I know that's kind of pushed forward. And if you were keen to open an Irish Wildlife Trust branch in Donegal, or a group in Donegal, something that we could help with through the volunteer centre, I suppose, with the registrations we had for today, I think there's definitely an interest out there in people engaging with that. So look, unless there's any other questions, we're going to draw it all to a close and let Kieran get back to his afternoon of minding the wildlife. So Kieran, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have it's great to have a talk on, well, not such a sunny day. We don't have a sunny day up here either, but something that we can all practically do at a household level to be able to help the bees and help sustain them. So no, thank you very much. And like you said, you'll send on some information. We'll share out the slides, your information, and a recording of the talk to everybody who registered. So good to meet you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, John. See you, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
You're welcome. See you now.